Thank you so much, John. I do recognize I stand between you and a well-deserved pint. So I'm going to see if I can tell you about 40 years of research and some of the paradigm changes that we've seen in that time and still bring you in on time. We'll keep our fingers crossed. You hold me to it. Um, when one thinks of the deep subsurface biosphere, this is almost always the first picture that people bring to mind. These are, of course, the fantastic discoveries beginning in the late 1970s at the hydrothermal vents and discovering that, in fact, life forms were there. It was a huge surprise to the first cruises because, of course, we thought life was constrained to the surface and photosynthesis. Some photosynthetic substrate goes down to the bottom, but nothing that could account for this. And it was the first discovery of life that was founded on microbes that were dependent not on photosynthesis, but chemosynthesis, literally living off of the chemistry of water rock reaction. But it isn't just in the oceans. And in fact, what we'll be talking to you about today is the expansion of the studies of habitability across the deep continental subsurface, because really that's where I have built my career over time. This is the phenomenon that we're looking at. It's great to speak to a room full of geologists because you know what the inside of a mine looks like. But the key thing to point out here is in many of these systems, and we work primarily in the Precambrian rocks of the planet. This particular picture is from South Africa. What we're looking at are naturally occurring deep groundwaters. So these are very different than drilling fluids. These are waters that are stored in fractures deep in the earth and released both away from mining by just natural tectonic activity, but within mining, of course, the excavation means these fractures are opened up and released into the mine workings. They're very salty. They have salinities on the order of hundreds of grams per liter. And in some cases, noble gas geochemistry signatures that match those of the primary inclusions in the rock. So we know these are not a function of the mining, but we use the mines to go down. And in fact, if you look back into the annals of the geological surveys, these have been identified over 100 years ago as vugs and cavities under great pressure in the subsurface, but somehow flew under the radar of the scientific community until about the 1980s. So again, highly saline water, natural to the rock, and also high degrees of dissolved gases that when we run through a plexiglass cylinder like this so you can see it, are exsolving dissolved gases. And I'll focus in particular on one component of those dissolved gases today, the hydrogen. Again, just to give you a sense of these, they're in systems all over the world: South Africa, the Canadian Shield, Sudan Mine in Minnesota. And just to point out, although I'll talk to you mostly about things that we discovered by going deep underground, where there are fractures, faults, and certain geology, these processes do manifest at surface. So this picture's there just to show you something that's actually taken 2 boots on the ground, looking only 1 meter underground. So the processes take place across the depths. We've spoken earlier about some of the hydrothermal vents. So just to give you that comparison between what's found there and what's found on the continents, again, I'll focus in just on hydrogen for a moment. The Lost City hydrothermal vent is one of the ultramafic systems on the ocean floor, known to produce huge amounts of hydrogen. This is Kidd Creek from the Canadian Shield, shown in the closed symbols. And it's just to show you that these systems are similarly rich in hydrogen. That corresponds to concentrations, dissolved concentrations between 5 to 15 millimolar. So it means in the exsolution phase, such as I showed you in the last picture, hydrogen may actually account for 30, 40, even 50% by volume of the free gas phase. So like the hydrothermal vents, what we've shown throughout the world is that these systems within Precambrian rock are some of the most hydrogen rich on the planet. Thank you so much, Jenny. I can skip right past this slide. I don't need to go into the link between serpentinization and hydrogen. So there we are. Serpentinization produces hydrogen. And so then it's no great surprise when one is working in the Precambrian terrains of the planet, we are working in the largest exposures of ultramafic rock in the Earth's history. And so indeed, many of our original sites are here within the vast, shown black here, but these are the vast Abitibi greenstone belts. Greenstone, of course, referring to the ultramafic rock and the serpentinization. And in 2014, we sort of collected from all over the world various sites where hydrogen had been found to demonstrate just how widespread this is. But again, I've got a room full of geologists, so you know ultramafic rock is not everywhere. And yet we find hydrogen persistently across these systems. So another part of the puzzle was to understand other hydrogen-producing reactions, of which there's one other major category, and that's a process that goes back to early experiments by Marie Curie. That in fact, when you have alpha, beta, and gamma particles and bombard water with those coming from just natural degradation or decay of uranium, thorium, and potassium in the crust, with the release of the radioactive rays, this decomposes water into hydrogen and the related oxides. And Li Hung Lin, I have to call out, this is a student that worked with T.C. Onstad and I back in 2005. He's now a professor at Taiwan University, and through a beautiful set of papers using both experiment, fieldwork, and modeling, was able to demonstrate that in much more felsic terrains away from the ultramafics, the major source of the hydrogen is coming from this radiolytic process. So as geochemists then, really what we're doing is working on understanding what we call the habitability. Where does the energy come from, the geochemical reactions that produce the electron donors, electron acceptors, and substrate that life might need? But we do this by working with some very talented friends in microbiology. So what I'm going to do now is turn from the geochemistry and show you not only the habitability, the fact that these environments have the energy that could support life, but show you what we've actually found in terms of what's living there. And so we'll be looking at then systems that are sustaining microbial life from water rock reactions. That's not the entire subsurface. Of course, water comes down and brings with it remnants of photosynthetic material from the surface that bugs can live on. And of course, buried organic matter sustains life. But as you go deeper and deeper and deeper, we move from life that's more dependent on photosynthesis and into this realm, like at the hydrothermal vents, of systems that are supported more and more by water rock reactions. And indeed, this has really changed our conceptual models of the habitability of Earth. And indeed, when we get down into these deepest, oldest systems, we can see from a whole variety of isotopic evidence in fractures that have been cut off from the surface on even millions to hundreds of millions of years, there's still a way for organisms to survive. And within these systems, indeed, isolated from the sun's energy, these processes of radiolysis that decompose water into hydrogen sustain all kinds of microbial activity. Many chemosynthetic metabolisms are driven by hydrogen as an electron donor. But hydrogen's not the only story, because in fact, we've been able to show as well that radiolysis is not just producing hydrogen. In addition, as those oxide radicals attack and produce an indirect radiolytic decomposition of sulfide minerals, you actually oxidize that reduced sulfur and transfer it to the water. So it's a force of sulfate as well. And we know that amongst other reasons. I don't know if there's any sulfur isotope geochemists here, but we know that amongst other reasons because this is a sulfate that in fact bears a mass-independent sulfur isotope signature, clearly showing it's coming out of the rocks by this indirect radiolytic composition. And further, there's a link to a carbon cycle. There's a production of small organic carbon molecules like acetate when you have carbonate minerals as well. So there's actually links in these systems to the hydrogen cycle, the sulfur cycle, and the carbon cycle. So what does this mean then in terms of biodiversity trends in the deep subsurface? We now know that there are in fact more than just photosynthetic habitability in the subsurface by material carried down, but that in fact, even when you're way beyond that in areas that are dependent on chemosynthesis, things can live. This has very much changed our thinking about the planet. We go back only one generation. We probably thought that below the critical zone, below a couple of 100 meters, nothing lived. We really thought the planet was sterile. We now know these processes go kilometers down. So what have we found then in terms of general trends of biodiversity as you go through these systems? Key to this is not just follow the hydrogen, which I've focused on so far, but follow the water. Because as you can imagine, the water plays a very important role in this, not only in enabling life, but also in providing us with the context to understand residence time. And so this takes us to the water cycle for a moment. If you Google water cycle, you will see about 1,200 photographs that look like this, right? We all learned this probably in sixth form, that when water goes down, it all comes back up. And we show this in picture after picture after picture. But actually, we all know that's not really true. Um, this is the canonical water cycle, meaning the meteoric water cycle in its traditional term, which is meaning in contact, water in contact with the atmosphere that retains its fingerprint of having recharged from the surface. And so we show even deep flow paths eventually all coming back up. And typically below a certain point, which is usually the crystalline rock, we essentially assume it's an impermeable basement. A couple of pictures might show a few cracks where a little water gets down there, but mostly we've had this idea that what goes down comes back up. And yet, for decades, we've known that's not true, and particularly the widespread use of groundwater dating techniques, both through decay, like radiocarbon, chlorine-36, krypton, but also through the noble gases, which allow us to date much, much older groundwater. We actually know that that's not true, and that in fact, there are pockets of water stored in fractures deep in the earth that are in fact millions, and even in some special places, billions of years old. So last year we decided we might as well get honest and rewrite the water cycle to make sure we incorporate all these processes that people have been studying, but we'd never gone back in and broken that paradigm. And so we published a paper last year on the hidden hydrogeosphere, in which we have estimates that much of this isolated water cut off from the meteoric water cycle on geologic timescales might account for a third to almost a half of all water on our planet. What is it made up with? Well, I'll go over this very quickly in the time we've got. Some of it is indeed water that came down in the past. Of course it is. Some of it are the products of the water rock reaction processes we've just talked about, radiolysis and serpentinization. Some of it's mixing with diagenetic and metamorphic fluids. Some of it is original formation water or fluid inclusions. All of these together are contributing to this deep trapped water that we see. And the key point then is that when one looks at the biodiversity of the subsurface, there's a tendency to think that, well, we'll plot it with depth. And depth is part of the story, but is not the entire story. Similarly, you can't plot it as a function of the age of the rock, because that can be very misleading. What we do here is to show that, in fact, if you take a look at all these geochronology of the water systems, that's really where you see a correlation. What changes in the biosphere is as a function of the age of the fluids. And I'll try to show you very quickly some of that and how it plays out together. So I'm going to go through a couple of major changes in biodiversity in the subsurface, but plotted against the mean residence time of those fluids. As I mentioned, it's not to say that things that come down from the surface aren't there. They absolutely are. In some systems, such as these in South Africa that we've studied, where the waters are only a couple of thousands of years old, indeed, you still find photosynthetic material, heterotrophs relying on the photosynthetic energy cycle, nematodes. You do see high hydrogen, but you see a lot of biodiversity. As you go deeper, though, things begin to change. In systems like these from the south part of the Witwatersrand Basin in South Africa, here you might have fluids that are on the order of couple of million years in terms of the residence time of the fluids. And there too, you still see very abundant biodiversity, certainly a lot of hydrogen metabolisms, but you may see sulfate reducers, methanogens, methanotropes. There's still a lot going on. The big jump is later, when you get into fluids that are on the order of tens to hundreds of millions of years in residence time. We still find life. It took a lot of work to try to do this, to isolate enough DNA back in 2005 to do these analyses. Again, I flag Li-Hung Lin's work, but what they found there was the first really big change. They found a system that was almost exclusively chemolithotrophic organisms just relying on the chemistry of water rock reaction. They're found at Mponeng mine in South Africa, with again ages on the order of tens of millions of years, very low biomass, very slow rates of reaction, and a dominance of these chemolithotrophic organisms, particularly in these very isolated systems. And then by the time you get over here to a place like Kidd Creek from the Canadian Shield, this is a system where the waters are as old as 1 billion years in age, based on the noble gas work that we've done, as young as 150 million years. But here too, again, that same story, a dominance of chemolithotrophic organisms deriving their energy for life from geology, from the water rock reaction. And what's fascinating about this is it has really changed our thinking about this planet and where we think life might be and how much life is on the planet. In the most saline fracture waters with the longest residence times and the most extreme hydrogeological isolation, like at the vents, we see chemolithotrophy dominate. There's high hydrogen, there may be sufficient sulfate and organic carbon, and yet we see very, very low biomass, sometimes only 10 to the 2 cells per mil, just tiny, and very low biodiversity. One mechanism by which we think these various parts of the deep biosphere intersect is when fractures open and mix. And certainly we see that. One mechanism that seems to release this bioactivity parking brake is if we get mixtures between the very, very deep systems, often rich in hydrogen, and waters that might be coming down from surface bearing more carbon. And there too, we start to see these much more bioactive systems. But the ones I highlighted for you today are really these down here, the deepest parts of these deep biosphere, where we think in the end, carbon sources may become the rate limiting process. They often have enough hydrogen, they usually have enough sulfate, but these very slow rates of reaction of radiolysis producing carbon-bearing compounds may be the ultimate rate limiting step for these systems. We're still obviously very deeply investigating them. And just to end then with a final slide, what's the importance of all of this? Well, it's shown us that this idea of follow the water is an important discovery technique, not just on Mars, but also on Earth. And life on our pale blue dot is not just a thin surface film, as we once might have thought, but permeates the subsurface at least to 3.5 kilometers. We have evidence for that, and likely considerably deeper, but there are very few places on Earth where we can get that deep. This subsurface biosphere contains biome, as we've seen, of different metabolic diversity and activity, and it's very much linked to the history of the water. The surface photosynthesis and meteoric water cycles or transitions to these biomes dominated by chemolithotrophic organisms, water rock reaction, and radiolytic chemistry. And cut off from the surface carbon cycle, they still survive. But how long they survive, we know it's geological timescales, but trying to resolve exactly how long they survive is a very interesting question, particularly if you want to use these systems in analog environments for the investigation of Mars. And beyond Mars, it's really when we move to Enceladus and Europa, the insight and the understanding that even on this planet, we had photosynthetic blinkers on. We thought all life on Earth was derived from photosynthesis. And so it's a good lesson to us to make sure that we not only think about everything that we've got on Earth in terms of habitability models when we go to investigate other targets in the solar system, but that we also maintain an openness and understanding that there's a wide variety of ways that life has found means to survive by exchanging electrons. And certainly if we were that far off on our own planet, you can imagine there may be a lot of other potential that still needs to be investigated in the context of really understanding the potential for life in these other systems. And so to end then, I just want to acknowledge, as you can imagine, a huge number of people who've contributed to the work that I showed you here over the last 40 years. These are our typical photographs. That's my team. 1, 2, 3. I mean, that really, I'm not joking. A lot of the pictures are that bad. And so I don't want to ensure that they toil away in the dark. So some of the major players are all thanked here in order to make sure that you actually see who they are, despite the darkness of the world that we're working in. Thank you.
Wow, Barbara, that was fantastic. Though you mentioned the breakthroughs in the 1970s, I think I remember that as a young teenager with the statement from Spock, "It's life, Jim, but not as we know it." So can we invite a couple of questions? David, you're very quick off the mark there.
Thanks. Yes, lots of questions, but I'll only ask one. You mentioned carbon being a limiting element. What about nitrogen? Where does the nitrogen come from that keeps these guys alive?
There's actually tons of nitrogen, but it's mostly present as N2. There's small amounts of nitrate, small amounts of nitrite. And, it's actually one of the still remaining questions for us to completely understand the nitrogen cycle down there. There's a variety of reactions. We know from metamorphic chemistry, right, that there are a variety of reactions that whereby, because of the possibility of substitution into clay minerals, that when we get metamorphism of clay-bearing units, you get production, release of release of nitrogen. So one possible source is simply that, given the degrees of metamorphism in some of these systems, the nitrogen may be coming from devolatilization of clays. But there's still a lot of questions around the tiny amounts of nitrate and nitrite.
Next question. Karen.
Fascinating talk. Thank you. My question was going to also be about nitrogen, but what sort of biomass are you sort of able to calculate? I mean,
The amounts?
yeah. How much is down there?
Yeah. There's a number of papers on this, and I'll say three things about it. One that's clear is that there's way more than we ever thought, given that even when I was in high school, we thought, I have still a textbook I used in some courses, which is a great textbook, except for the first chapter, which says the Earth is sterile below about a couple of 100 meters. Large amounts, because by the time you come up with a planetary volume of the Earth, even with very conservative assumptions, you can't make it a small number. That said, some of the estimates that are out there are what I call the tyranny of the mean. If you just pull average estimates, you can make numbers that are way too big. And so if you want to take a look at most probable estimates, you're best to make sure that you're not just taking a mean porosity, but you're taking a look at a whole range of porosities. So if you go to the literature, you'll find estimates that go from saying there's as much biomass in the deep subsurface as on the entire surface. Those are very optimistic calculations, I would say. There are other estimates that say more like 10%. And then there's everything in between. So at the moment, we really are a victim of our modeling approaches. One of the things that we're trying to use some of the Bayesian techniques and Monte Carlo techniques to actually come up with, incorporate probability and not just mean on these. And then in addition, one of the key things that we have to do is find ways, we cannot measure the entire Earth. So we've got certain areas that have been investigated. How do we then propagate, once we've done that process-based understanding of how they're living, there are ways we can then model how much might be living in a place that we cannot go and measure, or where we do go and measure, the amounts of water and biomass are so small, it's really hard to get answers. So we actually just did that. It's actually a nuclear waste study. It's for a system that's being looked at in terms of the context of nuclear waste. Obviously, there's no water, gas, or biomass there that's measurable. You'd never put a repository in a place that did. But by using some of these data, the process-based understanding and the Monte Carlo models, we're able to calculate what rates of habitability might be, even in an environment where we can't actually go and get the samples. So that has relevance as well to, Mars or other planets, where it's, if we get samples back, even Mars isn't looking so good right now, right? And with the cancellation of Mars sample return. So it's a really important question.
Thanks.
Do we have Peter?
The first thing I want to say is you are a most worthy recipient of the award. That was absolutely brilliant. It's completely outside my domain. I know nothing about the subject, but I come here as an economic geologist. Do you see any future for producing hydrogen out of deep mines, or is there anything that you can see that might help?
By next week, I'll be able to hand you a report that says that, yes. But essentially, yeah, there are connections to the ore deposits for sure. The production of sulfate goes way up when we're working in a sulfide-rich mine, and it's smaller in other places where you don't have the sulfide minerals. So obviously, some of the mineralogy is really important, either as a base stock for the chemical reactions, or some of the processes that we see actually are driven by catalysts, such as nickel and iron. And so one of the big questions should be, indeed, do we see more biology in and around these natural ore deposits, and less elsewhere? That's one part of it. And then the other part of it is, what can we do with this? If there's the large amounts of hydrogen that are coming out of these systems, and I've been saying this for years, the other thing that, as you can imagine, with all that radiogenic chemistry, we're also producing very large amounts of helium. So we've got a system in which you may have a mine already. It's an ultramafic rock. Perhaps you've got a critical minerals mine. And yet you're also producing hydrogen and helium. Suddenly you've got 3 economic reasons to develop that place. And, you know, coming from my country, where there's a lot of mining and a lot of mines that are riding their long-term future on just a small change in the main ore that they're producing. Nickel goes up, nickel goes down. It can just completely change the long-term prospects for a mine. If indeed some of these can help with that bottom line, then I think that very much. So it's a little different than what you often hear, that hydrogen is going to power the whole world. I'm not sure about that part. But localized use within some of these ultramafic rocks where we're already mining, this could be a very interesting proposition for localized reduction of energy and possibly decarbonization of the mining industry.
Well, I'm going to draw the afternoon to a close. So, Barbara, thank you again for such a wonderful talk.